Hello everyone and welcome back to Mossy Bottom here in the west of Ireland. Those of you who watched my earliest videos from the summer of 2018 may think that that's when the adventure began for me, but actually I moved to my little smallholding 2 years earlier, though at that time it was just an overgrown field and a tumble-down cottage. It still is a tumble-down cottage, but the land looked very different. There was no cabin, there was no caravan, no chickens or ducks or pigs, no vegetable beds or human beds for that matter. And even Moss, my border collie, didn't arrive until that first winter. It really was just me, my thoughts, and nature, in whose company I felt as blissfully insignificant as I ever have in my life. One thing I did have though was a diary. And for the first time in many years, I also had the inspiration to write things down. Even though my focus every day was the most mundane of activities, you know, making shelter, cooking, usually over an open fire, gathering water from a spring, clearing weeds, digging soil, it really did feel, coming from a city like I had, that I'd finally started living. So I'm going to begin this video with some reflections on my diary entries, which I recently looked through again from that first few months after arriving here in the summer of 2016. And then I'm going to tackle a question which I'm very frequently asked, and that's whether I have any regrets since moving here. Finally, in this video, I'm going to talk about some of my proudest moments in the 5 years, can you believe it's been that long, I've now lived here at Mossy Bottom. They won't all be the big accomplishments that you might expect, because I found, in my life at least, that it's often the small triumphs which make the biggest difference to your life. Here I sit, upon my own land, surrounded by pasture, woodland and meadow, listening to a chorus of birdsong, the like of which I haven't heard since my childhood. I'm in my car, the door is open but I'm quite motionless. Above me a pair of swallows weave through the air playfully. A finch darts beneath the eaves of the tumble-down fuel store to my right, and ahead of me on the lane to the cottage, a red-breasted robin periodically hops out of the dense hedgerows to steal an insect or two for its young. Yesterday I saw a jenny wren in the old barn, such a treat. In my entire life I've only ever seen one before now. They're the smallest native species living year-round in the British Isles. So small in fact that the beating of their tiny wings could easily be mistaken for a hummingbird. It was a magical moment watching her, cast in sunlight, pouring in through cracks in the wall, as she watched me with cocked head and bobbing tail. I felt more alive than I have in a long time. I've also seen a family of magpies, a thrush, jackdaws, a great tit and a blue tit, at least 2 species of finch which I couldn't identify, and I've heard in the boughs of a mighty sycamore tree the onomatopoeic notes of a cuckoo, which in this part of the world I believe to be the herald of summertime, all on my single acre of land. The abundance of life here is quite breathtaking, and its vitality and vigour fills me with the same. The flowers and plants, the bees and insects, the trees and birds, the sheer wildness of it all is utterly enchanting. That was my very first diary entry, written a day or two, I can't quite remember, after arriving here at what is now Mossy Bottom, but what was then just a cottage, a ruin with some land that I'd bought. And as I've talked about in other videos, I drove here alone with everything I owned jammed into or on the roof rack of my little Honda Jazz, which has now sadly retired to the great scrapyard in the sky. And I remember being terrified for the entire 13-hour journey that my overloaded car would break down. So when I did finally pull up to the cottage, exhausted as I was but alive, and the sun was shining and the birds were singing, the sense of relief was quite profound. And finally, my little cottage. For all her decrepitude, cracked walls, rotten windows, and twisted frame, I can't help but feel she's quite the most beautiful little house I've ever seen. Perhaps even more so for the trees and flowers sprouting willfully around her foundations. Nature, at least, will never abandon her. It was May, and I'd viewed the cottage back in February, so I'd been planning and worrying about the move for months. Frantically trying to buy everything I needed and get rid of everything I didn't. I had nothing in storage or with family, and I had no idea where or even if I could buy things here in Ireland. I didn't, if you can believe this, even know what the postal address was for the cottage here. Of course, the contract of purchase had an address written down on it, but it was so vague, with no postal code, and air codes, of course, weren't being used at that time. There was no house name or even street name. So it seemed impossible to me that letters or parcels would even reach me here. And you might think that sudden isolation with no friends or family nearby, no bed to sleep in. I really didn't have one. I was sleeping in the back of my car to begin with, and then a tent which I pitched. No kitchen to cook in, no toilet or bathroom to wash in. That would leave me feeling scared or alone. But I have no memory of those emotions of fear or loneliness. It was kind of as if nature knew that I was coming with all my foolish dreams, and was determined, despite her reputation in this part of the world, to make me feel safe and welcome. What I do remember is an immediate sense of peace, followed pretty quickly by a tremendous desire to get to work. I finally got my tent set up today, complete with blow-up mattress and cozy duvet. I never expected it to take so long, but clearing the metre-high jungle of grass, nettles, hogweed and bramble, amongst other things, was a mightier task than I'd anticipated. My back aches like it hasn't since my year working on farms in Canada, and my skin has been ravaged by nettles and midges, not to mention the sun. But I enjoyed it immensely nonetheless. There's something tremendously satisfying about doing hard physical work. Perhaps it's the exercise endorphins that people talk about, or the fact a glass of water is transformed into the nectar of gods. Food, however simple, becomes the most delicious thing you've ever tasted, and sleep comes effortlessly the instant your head hits the pillow. Knowing that I'm working on my own land, on my own home, is the icing on the cake. And that first summer, like every summer since really, I just worked away. First clearing the land to set up my tent so I had somewhere to sleep. I had been sleeping, as I say, in a sleeping bag in the boot of my car for the first week. And then setting up tarps to collect water for boiling and drinking, because at that time I didn't even know about my spring, which was utterly buried in vegetation. I was also collecting dry wood to cook soups and broths in my cast iron cooking pot over open fires. Don't forget, this was at the beginning of summer, so it was the perfect time to be kind of living outside and doing these things. And of course, I was also exploring the neighbourhood, discovering my local post office, which, alas, has forever closed. The following summer, in 2017, it closed forever. But at least I got to see it in operation for 1 year. My local town and food shop, the hills and forests that surrounded the cottage. It was a period of everyday exploration and excitement. And of course, completing those most basic of tasks, which, to put it simply and honestly, furthered my ability to just stay alive. And it was, without question, as happy a period as I've ever enjoyed in my entire life. But of course, the sun didn't last forever. Nature finally decided it was time to give me a true Irish welcome. The rain finally broke today. It has been a constant feature for the last week, despite being June. And I must admit, nothing drying out is beginning to wear on me a little. Today was very different though. Strong winds blowing in off the Atlantic. My rain tarp was severely tested. In fact, I had to reinforce it lest it should blow away across the hills. The cottage felt wilder than ever as the wind howled around its century-old stonework. Quite a different atmosphere to the breathless, muggy days of May. It's nearly dark now and still windy out. This'll be a very different night, snuggled up in the tent with my hot water bottle. This video is sponsored by Blinkist, which as an avid reader with very little free time, I am a huge fan of. Because Blinkist takes non-fiction books and condenses them into 15-minute text and audio blinks with all the key takeaway points. I love listening to them while working outside, be it digging potatoes as I have been recently, pulling up weeds, or just taking moss for a walk like I am today. It's a really cost and time efficient way to learn on the go, and of course to find out what a book's all about before committing to buying it. Blinkist has over 4,500 books in their library, with more being added every day, which you can read or listen to on your phone via the app, on a tablet, or if you'd prefer, on your desktop. There are best-selling titles like Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, that's a great read, and The Courage to be Disliked, both of which are very enlightening. But there are also many books relating to self-sufficiency, farming, and particularly nature, such as The Emerald Planet by David Beerling, which is all about the evolution of plants and how their importance is more far-reaching than most of us realise. It's fascinating, especially if you love the science of nature as much as I do. In fact, the BBC series How to Grow a Planet was even based on that book. And it's a good example of a book I first discovered on Blinkist and then went on to buy.
From the hottest deserts to the coldest Arctic tundras, plants are everywhere.
Finally, if you're interested in finding out more, then follow the link down in the description to get a free 7-day trial of Blinkist and then a whopping 25% off of a premium membership. So now on to one of the questions I'm most often asked, and that's whether I have any regrets about moving to a ruined cottage in rural Ireland, quitting my job, pursuing a self-sufficient life. And if you're a regular viewer of my channel, I don't think it will surprise you to learn that I certainly don't regret making that move. For the most part, although it's quite an exhausting life, I do love it. And I could talk about the joy I get from keeping animals, the pigs, the ducks, the chickens, or growing vegetables, like the ones you can see behind me, or being more connected with the seasons, which is a really significant thing if you're coming from a city, or building things, which I love doing, like my volunteer cabin and my granary. But I think what connects all the dots for me and makes this life so perfect is that sense of directing my own life and time, being in control, not being answerable to someone else. Getting to set my own schedule, working to my own rhythm, having bad days or weeks or even months, and equally having obsessive days or weeks or months where I don't stop doing something. Just getting to be myself, I suppose. And having thought about it a lot on one of my many woodland walks with Moss, who is currently right in front of me doing circles around one of the rabbit tractors, I've also come to realise that I don't really regret any of the mistakes that I've made since moving here. Though there have been many, I must say, because, you know, it's through those mistakes that I've learned things. And I think achieving your goals in spite of making mistakes along the way makes those achievements all the more meaningful. So I don't think mistakes are something to avoid in life or even to endure. I think they're actually something to embrace and celebrate. The key is not letting the mistake get you down or hold you back. So no regrets, but I am going to share with you my top 3 mistakes in the last 5 years. So perhaps anyone watching this who also quits the rat race and moves to a rural smallholding will be able to avoid making the same mistakes that I did, and I hope perhaps make some different ones instead. Number 1 is water. In that first year, I drank water from my spring, which is just in front of me here. It was the only water that I drank every day, and I used a ceramic and charcoal filter. I had a 2-filter system, but sadly, it just wasn't enough because I got sick, really sick. I was actually in hospital for 10 days, and it took me quite a long time after that to recover fully. And I knew moving here that May, the old lady who lived in this cottage before me, had drunk directly from that spring because my neighbours told me. And she lived into her 80s, so knowing that, I was fairly confident about drinking it, especially considering I was also filtering it. But in hindsight, it was clearly a mistake. Perhaps my immune system wasn't as strong or wasn't used to this water. People sometimes ask me why I buy bottled water rather than drinking my own. And the answer simply is to guarantee that I don't get sick again, because that was really scary. And that's not to say that there aren't ways to make water safe, more comprehensive filtration systems like using UV, which I probably will explore at some point in the future when I have a bit more money to invest. But for the moment, the spring water is for washing, it's for cleaning, and just about everything else except drinking. Number 2 is really all about understanding your climate and your environment and working with it so that you can get the most from it. And this is a really important principle of permaculture and self-sufficiency. And permaculture is something I try and incorporate into my life as much as I can, and I am going to produce a video series about it in the not too distant future, I hope. So before arriving here, I had a design for the land. I literally spent months taking the aerial footage from Google Maps and superimposing onto that sketches and diagrams and designs for every corner of the land here at Mossy Bottom and what I would use it for. And it was fairly well informed. You know, I had done my research, I'd read the books, and a lot of it has worked very successfully, but not everything. And a good example of that is my forest garden, which I planted with quite a few heat-loving cherry and pear trees on a very sunny but also very windswept area of high ground up behind the cottage and the caravan, because logically I wanted the shade from those trees to be cast away from my vegetable area onto my neighbour's field. It was a terribly sensible plan on paper, but in reality, every May, the cherry and pear blossom is promptly blown off in the May winds because it's such a windy spot, and I get no fruit. Even the apple trees there have yet to yield anything, I think for the same reason, and that's 4 years after planting them as bare root trees. And the lesson is that however logical a plan might seem on paper, you have to listen to the land and understand what species of plant and animal will and will not do well there. I learned that lesson well in those early years. If you want to be self-sufficient or as close as you can, then focus on growing what will thrive in your local climate, not just in the wider area, but the specific pockets of land that you have. And then find ways to turn the excess of that crop into a small amount of money to pay for the foods that don't thrive well. That, I think, is a much better approach to self-sufficiency than trying to force the land to do what you want it to do. My number 3 mistake is all about my cats. For years I didn't want to get cats because I was worried that they'd decimate the bird population here, and I love the birds. So every year I'd invent new contraptions and methods to try and store my potatoes and my other crops so as to keep the rodents off. And that was the biggest motivation to get cats, to control the rodent population. And unfortunately every year half of the potatoes would get nibbled on, and not just by mice, I have to say, but also by their bigger, fatter, far scarier and more dangerous relatives. I was also worried with cats that moss wouldn't get along with them, or that, living out here in the wilds, they'd become as uncivilized as I think I have. But honestly, I shouldn't have worried. Since getting them, I can effectively store my potatoes because the rodents stay away. I think they can just sense the presence or the scent of the cats. Moss seems to actually enjoy their company, and they, with typical feline aloofness, just ignore moss most of the time. And also, they're the most loving, affectionate creatures here at Mossy Bottom. They're so gentle and timid, but they're also excellent hunters. But, there's always a but, finally getting cats has taught me another lesson, and that's to always cover my carrot beds with nets. Because this year, unlike the last 2 or 3, the cats decided to use that lovely friable soil in my carrot beds, which is the only area I work with a rotavator as a convenient litter tray. And as a result, my carrot crop this year is almost non-existent. It's maybe 1/10 of what it should be. I think as seedlings they were just being overdosed with nitrogen from all that urine from the cats. But if anyone out there knows exactly why cats and carrot beds or vegetable beds in general don't mix, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to know the science behind it. What's going on when a cat does its business in your vegetable bed that stops those vegetables growing properly? And now for my proudest moments. And of course, I'm only part way through the journey here at Mossy Bottom, so I know there'll be many more to come. The biggest, I hope, will be finishing the cottage restoration and spending my first night in there since the winter of 2016. But in the 5 years that I've been here, here's my top 5 moments so far. Number 1 is digging up my first homegrown potato plant, and you can see my potato rows behind me now. I've already started digging them up. But in that first growing season, most of my crops were a complete and utter disaster. So when a year later, in the summer of 2017, I planted potatoes in newly dug soil for the first time, I was actually quite skeptical about how well they'd do. I now use Sapo Mira blight-resistant potatoes as my main crop, but back then all I had was some leftover roosters from a bag of store-bought potatoes. But that moment when the rich black soil fell away, leaving a dozen or more tubers, representing a week at least of dinners for me, that was just magical. There's something about digging up potatoes specifically. It's just about the closest you can get, I think, to digging for treasure. I find it so exciting, even now, years later. But that first year that I grew potatoes, harvesting them for the first time since childhood, from my own land as well, and then cooking and eating them that very evening, that was something else entirely. I'll never forget that. Number 2 is the moment I saw Fatso, my ginger cooney pig, who you may be able to see briefly in the background there, use her snout to turn over the soil and eat the grass and weed roots for the very first time. And that may sound like a terribly insignificant, mundane thing, seeing a pig dig, but to me, that was a really big deal. Of course, when Fatso and Titch first joined me here, they were mere piglets, so it took a few months before they began to plough. And I was always quite worried that being cooney pigs, a breed of pig that is not known for its ploughing ability. In fact, many people claim that they don't dig at all, which certainly hasn't been the case with mine. But I was quite worried that they wouldn't plough. So that moment And I remember it really well. I remember where they were at the time. It felt like such a step forward, because to me it represented a huge amount of work which I no longer had to do. Not only were they ploughing the soil and eating the weed roots right out of it, but they were also adding fertility back in, ready for my next vegetable crop. You can hear them there agreeing with me. There's something so fulfilling to me about being able to keep animals as working companions, living happy, rich lives, whilst also contributing to my ability to thrive here. It's a wonderful thing, I think, and it's something I wish more people did. Animals don't need to just be a food source or just be a pet. There is another way, and it's what our ancestors did for generations. Number 3 was spending my first night in the caravan, which you might just be able to see up there behind me on the hill. And of course, I had a real mattress after more than a year of sleeping on an old sofa in the cottage. And that moment was also back in 2017. It was a pretty momentous year for me, that. And believe me, even though the caravan is tiny, it's also warm and it's cozy, not least because I installed a wood-burning stove when I was renovating it. It's interesting, isn't it, how lots of people would balk at the thought of spending a night in a 25-year-old caravan with limited space and thin walls, whereas to me at that time, and still to be honest, it felt like I'd moved into a 5-star hotel because of what I'd come from. It was warm, it was dry, and compared to the cottage, it was incredibly comfortable and luxurious, if you can believe that. Number 4 has to be the moment that I filled my water tank using an electric pump, which I still have to this day down in my spring. And even though I don't drink the water, with no mains water connection at all here, it's still vital as a resource for washing clothes, for washing dishes, for showering, and all the other things that myself, volunteers and guests use water for during the day. And of course the animals and the plants in my polytunnel. Of course, there are no flushing toilets here at Mossy Bottom, only composting toilets, so that isn't a concern. But I still remember turning on that well pump for the very first time and watching my 200-litre tank. I now have a 1,000-litre tank, which was an old recycled IBC, but back then I just had one of those blue 200-litre barrels, and it used to take me 2 hours to fill that by hand with one bucket in each hand, carrying them up from my spring. And it filled with the electric pump in about 15 minutes, which blew my mind. All it took was the press of a button. It was an incredible moment, and I've talked about several times before the balance between making things easy enough to have free time to work on those big projects, whilst not making them so easy that the fundamentals of life, like food, water, warmth and shelter, don't require any effort. Because if everything's easy, then nothing really matters. But that pump transformed my life in a positive way. It freed up a lot more time to do other things. Finally, number 5 on my list of proudest moments here at Mossy Bottom has got to be the day I arrived. We've come full circle, folks, right back to that diary entry at the beginning of the video. I will never forget the moment that I put the handbrake on and stepped out of my little Honda Jazz, completely alone, no people, no traffic. The only sound was coming from birds calling and insects humming. For me, it truly was like emerging from underwater and taking the deepest breath that I've ever taken. Just that opportunity was all I really needed to start thriving. But, getting there wasn't easy. As I've said in other videos, I worked for a decade to save enough money to buy the cottage and land here. There were no handouts, no family supporting me, and I think that probably made that moment all the more special. I know people talk about us being custodians of the land, and I fully subscribe to that belief. I feel like I am a custodian of this land. But that moment was the first time in my life that I was able to look at a tree or a plant or a blade of grass and call it mine. And I was surrounded by them. It was life-changing. And right there, in that moment, I had purpose. Okay everyone, you've heard this line a dozen times by now, but that's just about it for this video. Thank you as always for watching, subscribing and supporting the channel. I'm about to head to the shops and see if I can buy some more jars for canning, as I have another 2 huge boxes of homegrown tomatoes in need of storing. Thanks for all the great tips, by the way. The jars I was using do have silicone seals. A few of you asked that. I just didn't show them in the video. But they were a little too big, I have to admit, even for my giant pan. So the new ones I'm hoping to buy will be smaller, so I can fit them in upright. And that tip about using a chopstick to poke out the air bubbles was brilliant. I'll definitely be doing that. There are some exciting new videos coming up on my channel in the next few months, content which you may not have seen before, which involves me for the first time leaving my little smallholding and venturing out there into the wilds of Ireland. So it's a busy time for me here at Mossy Bottom. For now though, from me, Moss, who's got his nose stuck in the stream, take care and bye for now. Born in a Quaker town where folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day." When the sun rose low, back to work they'd go, singing on their way. For job and home to call our own, we'll work as another day. Oh, I grew up.